He was an ordinary man who lived a quiet life in a small town. Most people in his neighborhood would pass him on the street and think nothing of it. He had a regular job at an office, where he worked long hours doing tasks that were important but never exciting. Nobody would have guessed that he had a talent that could leave an entire room speechless. He liked simple things, walking early in the morning, drinking coffee while reading a newspaper, and taking quiet moments to think about life. Music had always been a secret part of his life. He played the piano at home late at night when nobody was around. He didn't seek attention or praise. For him, music was a way to express feelings he couldn't put into words. One morning, he found himself walking past a small town square where there was an old piano. It was out in the open, covered with scratches and faded paint, a piano that had seen better days. People were passing by, some heading to work, others just wandering around. A few kids were laughing near a fountain. He paused, looking at the piano. Something inside him stirred, a quiet urge he hadn't felt in years. He had passed that piano many times before, but today it felt different. He felt drawn to it, as if it was calling him. He walked closer and looked around. The square was not crowded, but enough people were present to notice him. Some were sitting on benches, sipping drinks, chatting quietly. Others were standing, waiting for friends, scrolling through their phones. He could feel their eyes, a mix of curiosity and mild amusement. They didn't know him. They didn't expect anything from him. In fact, he could see a few people smirking, thinking he might be trying to make a joke. He could feel the doubt in the air. It made his hands tremble slightly, but he didn't step away. Instead, he slowly lifted the piano cover, revealing the keys that had been untouched for a while. He hesitated, his mind filled with thoughts. What if they laughed at him? What if he made a mistake and it sounded wrong? He could almost hear the whispers even before they happened. But then he remembered the nights spent at home, when the music flowed effortlessly under his fingers, when the sound filled empty rooms and made his heart lighter. That feeling, that sense of being alive through music, was stronger than his fear. He sat down slowly, his heart beating faster with every second. The people around him started noticing. Some stopped to watch, curious. Some raised their eyebrows, thinking this was going to be amusing. A few took out their phones, ready to record what they assumed would be a funny moment. He placed his fingers gently on the keys, feeling the smooth surface, remembering the touch he loved so much. He closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath, and then pressed a key. A note rang out, soft but clear. The sound seemed to hang in the air, and he could feel a small shift in the crowd. Some people stopped talking. Others tilted their heads, unsure if they were hearing correctly. He played another note, then a chord. Slowly, he began to play a melody, not rushed, not loud, just steady and natural. It was the kind of music that came from the heart, full of emotion and meaning. The crowd started to change. Laughter faded. Whispers grew quiet. People who were thinking this was a joke began to pay attention. Some smiled softly, sensing that this was something different. He continued, his fingers moving almost automatically, guided by years of practice and love for the piano. Each note seemed to tell a story that words could never capture. It was a story of life, of quiet struggles, of moments of joy hidden between ordinary days. People leaned in slightly, wanting to hear more, not realizing they were witnessing something special. He remembered the times when he had doubted himself, times when he had been told he wasn't good enough, that music was just a hobby, that no one would ever care. But here, in this square, with strangers around him, he felt a sense of freedom. No one knew him. No one had expectations, and yet the music was speaking louder than any words. He played with feeling, with passion that had been kept inside for too long. He could feel the tension in the air slowly shifting, turning into awe. The notes were weaving through the square, reaching into the hearts of people who had walked by without thinking twice. A young woman sitting on a bench dropped her coffee, startled by the beauty of the sound. An older man paused mid-step, his hands in his pockets, and listened, forgetting where he was going. Even the children playing near the fountain stopped for a moment, sensing something unusual, something magical. The man at the piano didn't look up. He didn't need to. He was lost in the music and the connection he was creating without speaking a single word. Every note was a message, every chord a story. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours to him. The piano, though old and scratched, seemed to respond to him as if it had been waiting for this moment. People around him started to understand that this was not a performance meant for fame or applause. This was music born from a quiet life, from a heart full of untold emotions. Some of the people who had been ready to laugh now had tears in their eyes. Some whispered to each other, unable to express what they felt. The music had broken through their casual indifference, their skepticism, their disbelief. Even he felt the change within himself. He was not the same man who had walked into the square a few minutes ago. Something had shifted. The fear, the doubt, the worry about what others would think had all melted away. It was just him and the piano, and the music flowing freely between them. For a moment he felt a connection to every person around him, a silent understanding that transcended words. They might not know his story, but the music spoke for him. He finished the piece slowly, letting the final note linger. The square was silent for a heartbeat. Then people began to react. Some clapped gently, unsure of how to express their amazement. Others stood quietly, not wanting to break the moment. A few faces were red with emotion, tears quietly rolling down cheeks. He looked up briefly, and for the first time, saw their reactions. The surprise, the awe, the respect, it all washed over him. They had thought it was a joke, that he was just pretending. And now he had left them speechless. He closed the piano cover and stood up, his hands still tingling from the music. People approached slowly, wanting to say something, to ask questions, to compliment him. Some took pictures, others just watched, not knowing how to respond. But he didn't speak much. He smiled softly, thanked them quietly, and stepped back. The moment had been enough. The music had done the talking, and that was all he needed. He walked away feeling lighter, freer, knowing that he had shared a piece of himself that no one would ever forget. The piano remained, waiting for the next person, but the memory of what had happened that day would linger in the square for a long time. A reminder that talent often hides in the most ordinary people, waiting for the right moment to shine. The man walked away from the piano that day. But his mind didn't leave the music behind. Every step he took felt heavier, though he tried to act casual. The crowd had been kind, surprised, some even emotional, but their reactions now replayed in his mind, louder than anything he had expected. He had always been quiet, blending into the background, never asking for attention. And now, without warning, attention had found him. It was not just the sound of the piano he remembered, it was the way people had looked at him. The way they had stopped what they were doing, the way they had paused. As if caught in a moment that had nothing to do with the ordinary world around them, he kept replaying that moment as he walked back home. Doubts began to creep in, small at first, like whispers in an empty room. What if it had been a fluke? What if the piano had somehow sounded better than it actually was? What if they were only being polite? These thoughts mingled with his earlier confidence, creating a strange knot of excitement and fear in his chest. He had lived his whole life avoiding attention, avoiding mistakes, avoiding embarrassment. And now he had thrown himself into a public moment, vulnerable and exposed. And yet, the music still resonated in him, stronger than the doubts, louder than the fear. The next morning, he woke up with a heaviness he hadn't felt before. Sleep had not eased his mind. The memory of the crowd, the piano, the sound, it all stayed with him. He thought about going back to the square, about playing again, but the thought was paired with panic. He pictured people watching, judging, expecting something that he wasn't sure he could give. His hands, which had moved so naturally over the keys before, now felt uncertain. His fingers twitched nervously as he imagined them pressing down on the keys. Perhaps producing something wrong, perhaps disappointing the small group who had admired him. The fear of failing publicly for the first time ever was overwhelming. He decided to take a walk to clear his mind. The town was waking up, the streets quiet but for a few cars and early risers. He watched people pass by, couples holding hands, people walking dogs, someone delivering newspapers. Each small scene seemed ordinary, almost mundane, yet it reminded him that life went on whether or not he played the piano. and yet he felt a pull back to it, stronger than anything else he had felt in years. Music was not just a hobby. It was a lifeline, a language he had known longer than words. But could he risk being judged? Could he face the eyes of strangers again, knowing that this time he would have no safety net? He spent hours thinking, pacing in his small apartment, letting the doubts fight with the courage he felt inside. Memories came back from his childhood, his first encounter with a piano, sitting on a tiny bench, hitting the wrong notes, laughing and learning to try again. He remembered late nights spent practicing in secret, his fingers aching, his heart swelling with the beauty of each melody as it emerged. He remembered moments when music had been his only solace, his only friend. And he realized that all the fear, all the doubts, could never outweigh the need to play. Music was not about praise or applause. It was about expression, about telling a story that words could never reach. Finally, he decided that he would go back to the square. Not for the crowd, not for recognition, not even for the applause that had come before. He would go back for himself, to prove that he could face the fear. That he could do what he loved, regardless of what others thought. It was a quiet, determined decision. He knew that stepping back into the public eye would be difficult, but he also knew that the music inside him demanded to be heard. And so he prepared himself mentally, thinking of nothing but the feel of the keys under his fingers. The sound that had once made strangers stop in their tracks. The music that had been his companion for so many years. When he returned to the square, he noticed the piano immediately. It was still there, waiting, its worn keys glinting softly in the morning light. The square was slightly busier now, more people walking through, some with coffee in hand, some chatting casually. Not noticing him yet, he hesitated at the edge of the crowd. Some people glanced at him, curious, but none seemed to know what to expect. A small knot of people stood nearby, watching the fountain, unaware of the silent anticipation building in him. He felt his heart hammering against his ribs, the familiar fear mixed with anticipation. A storm of emotions he hadn't felt in years. He took a deep breath and approached the piano slowly. Every step felt significant, as if each movement carried the weight of years of doubt and secrecy. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the cover. The keys looked the same as before, familiar yet intimidating. He ran his fingers lightly over them, remembering the smooth touch, the potential in each note, the power to move hearts silently. He closed his eyes and imagined the music flowing freely from his mind to his hands, just as it had countless times before in the quiet of his own home. But now, there were eyes on him, watching, expecting something uncertain. And he felt the pressure building. He began with a single note, testing, feeling, letting the sound fill the air. He could hear the faint rustle of the crowd, some stopping to pay attention. Others still distracted by their phones or conversations. He played another note, then a chord, letting the melody slowly build. The music was deliberate, careful, and yet full of life. Every note he played was measured, conscious of the silence around him. He could feel the tension in the crowd, the skeptical energy, and it only fueled him to play with more emotion, more depth. He wanted the music to speak for him, to tell the story of a lifetime spent learning, practicing, doubting, and finally taking a risk. As he continued, he felt himself becoming immersed in the music. The fear that had gripped him moments ago began to fade, replaced by a quiet focus. The crowd began to notice the change. Some people paused in their conversations, their attention caught. Some lowered their phones, realizing that this was not a joke, that something genuine and beautiful was unfolding before them. The music seemed to reach into the hearts of those who were watching, touching emotions they hadn't expected to feel on an ordinary day in a small town square. He could feel the room transforming, the ordinary moment becoming extraordinary. All because he had decided to face his fear and play. For a long time, he played without stopping, letting the music flow naturally. Every note carried intention. Every pause meant something. He remembered the lessons from years of practice, the importance of patience, letting the music breathe, of feeling each chord before moving to the next. The crowd's skepticism melted away, replaced by curiosity, then wonder, then silent admiration. Some people moved closer. Some stopped completely, leaning in to hear every nuance. He didn't notice the time passing, didn't notice the changes in the light or the shifting expressions on people's faces. There was only the music and the moment, and he was completely present. Inside, felt a sense of liberation he hadn't experienced in years. The fear that had plagued him, the constant worry about judgment, the doubts about his abilities, all of it seemed to vanish under the power of the music. He realized that the true risk had not been in playing for others, but in denying himself the chance to express what was inside. The piano had become a bridge, connecting him to the world, even if only for a brief time, and he understood more than ever that this connection was worth every moment of anxiety, every trembling finger, every heartbeat that threatened to give away his fear as he played. He could sense the crowd shifting around him. Some faces were softened with emotion, others were wide-eyed with surprise, all of them quietly acknowledging the unexpected beauty emerging from the man before them. For the first time, he felt the music was not just for him. It's not just a personal escape, but a shared experience, a moment that could touch anyone who was willing to listen. And that thought filled him with a strange, new kind of courage. He was no longer simply playing for himself. He was playing for the people who had doubted him, for those who had thought it was a joke, for the ones who had no idea what they were about to witness. The final notes of his piece hung in the air, long and deliberate, echoing slightly in the square. There was a heartbeat of silence, a pause that seemed to stretch, before people began to react. Some clapped gently, in awe and respect. Some whispered, unable to articulate what they felt. Others simply stood still, their eyes wide, hearts touched by the music. He closed his eyes briefly, feeling the power of the moment. The confirmation that facing his fear had not only been worth it, but necessary. He had risked embarrassment and judgment, and in return, he had shared a part of himself that words could never describe. The music had spoken for him, and for a brief time, it had connected hearts in a way that nothing else could. He took a deep breath. Feeling the warmth of the morning sun on his back and the weight of the moment pressing lightly on his shoulders, the square was alive with ordinary activity, but there was a sense of anticipation, almost invisible, that made the air feel different. As he sat at the piano, he closed his eyes for a second, letting the memory of countless nights of practice fill his mind. Each note he had ever played in private came rushing back, and he allowed his fingers to find their way instinctively across the keys. The first note rang out softly, a small, clear sound that seemed to capture a quiet attention from the crowd. Conversations stopped, laughter faded, and even the birds seemed to pause. People turned their heads, curiosity mingling with uncertainty. They were not sure what to expect, but they were ready to watch. He played another note, then a chord, and slowly a melody began to unfold. It was gentle at first, almost tentative, like a shy whisper reaching out into the world. The music carried a weight, a feeling that had grown in him over years of secret practice and quiet reflection. Each note seemed to speak of moments he had lived through alone, the late nights when he felt invisible, the quiet mornings when he had nothing but music to comfort him, the struggles that no one had ever seen. And as the notes spilled into the square, the crowd felt it too, even if they did not yet understand why. Some people shifted closer, drawn by the sound. Others stopped completely, letting the music wash over them without thinking with each chord. The man felt his confidence grow. The fear he had carried moments ago melted away, replaced by a flow of energy that came only when he was fully immersed in music. His fingers moved naturally, guided by memory and emotion rather than thought. The melody rose and fell, soft and tender, then stronger and more deliberate. There was a story in every note. A story that had nothing to do with fame or attention, and everything to do with the life he had lived. People around him began to sense it, their faces reflecting surprise, curiosity, and slowly, awe. Those who had assumed this was a joke now looked at him with a quiet reverence. A small group of teenagers near a fountain stopped mid-laugh. One of them whispered something to the others, but they fell silent again, listening. The music seemed to pull them in, connecting strangers who had never spoken before. A woman walking past with a bag of groceries paused, one hand frozen in the air, listening. The man at the piano did not notice the crowd growing. He only noticed the music, the way it allowed him to breathe, to exist fully in the moment. Each chord was intentional, each pause filled with emotion. He was telling a story without words, but one that everyone could understand if they chose to listen. As the melody continued, it grew richer and more layered. His hands moved with precision and ease, striking chords that carried depth and warmth. He thought of the quiet nights at home when he had practiced this piece alone, the hours of repetition that had shaped each movement.
Countless times
He had hesitated and tried again. And now, here in the open square, the music had found a new life. It was no longer just for him. It was for the people who had gathered. For the strangers who had paused their ordinary routines to witness something extraordinary. The notes seemed to fill the space, wrapping around listeners, lingering in the air, connecting hearts that had never met. A man standing near a coffee cart let out a small gasp, almost involuntarily. He had been walking quickly, thinking about his workday, his errands, his own worries. And suddenly, the music had stopped him. It was unexpected, beautiful, moving. Even the children playing nearby fell quiet, watching, listening, absorbing the emotion that flowed effortlessly from the piano. The music did not demand attention. It invited it. And in that invitation, the crowd began to change. Skepticism and amusement faded, replaced by focus, engagement, and genuine emotion. They were no longer observers. They were participants, quietly experiencing something that had nothing to do with spectacle and everything to do with honesty. The man felt himself becoming more confident, more alive. The melody grew stronger, more expressive. His fingers danced across the keys with purpose, but without forcing, as if the piano and his hands were one. He allowed pauses, silences between notes that carried as much meaning as the chords themselves. The crowd felt it too. They leaned in unconsciously, sensing the weight and beauty of each moment. There was no rush, no competition, no expectation. The music and the shared experience it created. And in that moment, the man realized something profound. Fear could only touch him when he let it. But joy and connection were stronger than any doubt. The music continued, evolving naturally, blending soft, delicate moments with powerful emotional surges. People began to notice small details, the subtle way his hands moved, the emotion in his posture, the intensity with which he approached each note. The music told a story that was bigger than him and yet intimately personal. It spoke of struggle and perseverance, of quiet victories and unseen battles, of a life lived mostly in silence and observation. And the crowd, without even speaking, understood. They felt the honesty, the vulnerability, and the mastery. The piano was no longer just an instrument. It was a voice, a language that everyone could understand. A woman standing near a street lamp wiped a tear from her cheek discreetly. She had not expected to be moved so deeply in such an ordinary place. She exchanged a glance with a stranger beside her, and they both smiled faintly, acknowledging a shared experience they would not forget. A young man leaning against a railing had stopped scrolling on his phone, his attention fully captured. For him, the music was like a bridge to something he had almost forgotten: beauty, emotion, connection. And all the while, the man at the piano played on, unaware of the individual stories unfolding around him, unaware of the lives he was touching with each note. He played with everything he had, letting the music flow freely, letting it speak for the years of quiet practice, for the moments of doubt, for the nights of loneliness and hope. Every chord was filled with intention, every note a message, every pause a breath of honesty. The crowd, now fully attentive, watched as something ordinary transformed into something remarkable. They had thought this might be a joke, a moment of amusement, a fleeting distraction. And yet, here was something real, raw, and beautiful, rising from an unexpected source. Their disbelief melted away, placed by quiet admiration and wonder. As he reached the climax of the piece, the music swelled, powerful and yet graceful. His fingers moved with incredible control, yet the emotion behind each note was impossible to ignore. The crowd was completely absorbed, leaning forward, holding their breath, feeling the story unfold around them. Strangers exchanged glances, their hearts touched in ways they could not explain. Children who had been running and playing now stood still, mesmerized. Adults who had been focused on their routines paused, caught in a moment that felt both intimate and universal. The music had transcended ordinary boundaries, connecting people in a way that words could not. Finally, the piece began to slow, tapering into gentle, soft notes, each one lingering in the air. He felt a calm settle over him, a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition or applause. The music had done what it was meant to do. It had expressed what was inside him. It created connection. It had touched hearts. He let the final note resonate, letting it fade naturally into silence. The square was still for a heartbeat, as if holding on to the moment, unwilling to let it go. Then, slowly, the reactions began. Some people whispered, some clapped quietly, some simply stood in stunned silence, processing what they had just heard. The transformation had been complete. They had come expecting perhaps a joke, a passing curiosity, a minor distraction. Instead, they had witnessed something extraordinary, something that would stay with them far longer than the morning sun. The man at the piano leaned back slightly, breathing slowly, his heart still racing, his hands tingling from the exertion and emotion of the performance. He looked up for a brief moment and saw the expressions on the faces of the crowd: surprise, awe, quiet joy, and even tears. Their disbelief had been replaced by respect and admiration. They had thought it was a joke, but now words failed them. The music had left them speechless, and in that silence, he found a profound sense of fulfillment. He had shared a piece of himself, a part that had always existed quietly, hidden from the world. And now it had been received openly, honestly, and beautifully. The man at the piano could feel the crowd shift around him like a tide moving quietly but with power. Faces that had been skeptical moments ago now reflected surprise and wonder. Some people had stopped in their tracks, unable to look away. Others had leaned closer, drawn by the music as if it had reached into their hearts and gently pulled them forward. The energy in the square was no longer ordinary. It was electric, alive with emotions that had nothing to do with the day-to-day routines everyone had been carrying. It was a quiet transformation, subtle yet profound. And it was happening all around him. He continued to play, letting his fingers glide across the keys naturally, without thought or hesitation. The melody had grown deeper, richer, more complex, yet never overwhelming. Every chord seemed to speak to someone in the crowd, telling a story they didn't know they needed to hear. A young woman sitting on a bench held her hands together tightly, her eyes glistening as tears formed. She had come to the square simply to enjoy the morning, not expecting to encounter something that would move her so completely. Beside her, a man who had been walking hurriedly slowed his pace, pausing to let the music reach him. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the sound wash over him. Feeling emotions he hadn't thought about in years, children playing near the fountain stopped abruptly. Their laughter faded into silence, replaced by a quiet fascination. One little boy tilted his head, listening carefully, as if trying to understand the language of the music. The girl beside him reached out, holding his hand for reassurance. But she too was captivated, her eyes fixed on the pianist. The man at the piano did not notice the small details at first. He was lost in the music, in the flow of emotion that had carried him from fear and hesitation to full expression. But slowly, he began to sense it, feeling the connection he had created with each person who had paused to listen. A woman with a coffee in hand stopped mid-step. She hadn't expected to feel anything extraordinary that morning, yet here she was, tears forming in her eyes. She glanced at a stranger next to her and shared a quiet smile, silent acknowledgement that they were both experiencing something rare and beautiful. A man leaning against a wall, who had been scrolling on his phone moments before, now had his device tucked away. He watched the pianist, completely engaged, as if the world around him had disappeared. The music had the power to hold attention, to reach beyond distraction, to pull people fully into the moment. And that was exactly what it was doing. The melody grew softer, delicate, almost fragile. The pianist's hands moved with care, allowing pauses between notes that hung in the air, resonating with emotion. Each pause felt intentional, giving the listeners time to absorb, to reflect, to feel. Some people closed their eyes, letting the music speak directly to their hearts. Others shifted slightly, leaning forward, drawn into the narrative woven by the pianist's skill and emotion. There was a hush over the crowd, shared understanding that something extraordinary was unfolding, something that did not require words or explanation. The man felt the music flowing through him, stronger and more confident with each passing moment. The fear he had felt earlier was gone completely, replaced by a sense of purpose. A knowledge that the music was not only for him, but for the people who had stopped to listen. He played with intention, with passion, with a depth that could only come from years of experience, practice, and quiet devotion. Every note, every chord, every pause carried meaning. He could feel the impact of the music on those around him. But he was not distracted. He allowed it to fuel his performance, to deepen the emotion in every key he pressed. A man standing near a tree had tears in his eyes, and he discreetly wiped them away. He had been caught off guard, unprepared for such an emotional connection in a public square. The music had reached him in a way nothing else could have. Glanced at his companion, and both shared a quiet nod of understanding. A young woman who had been reading a book now had it closed in her lap, her attention fully captivated by the sounds that seemed to fill every corner of the space. It was as if the music had created a bridge between all these strangers, connecting them in a way that was both subtle and profound. The man at the piano continued, allowing the melody to rise and fall naturally, building in intensity without force, expressing emotion without excess. He thought of the times he had played alone when the notes had only echoed in empty rooms. He realized the power of sharing that music. The connection was palpable now. People were leaning in, listening, experiencing the music in a way that went beyond mere entertainment. It was a conversation of sorts, a silent dialogue between the pianist and the audience, carried entirely by the flow of notes and the spaces between them. As the piece progressed, he noticed small gestures from the crowd. Some people had tears in their eyes, some smiled softly, some held their hands over their hearts. There were no words, no clapping yet, only a shared recognition of something moving, beautiful, and unexpected. Even those who had come expecting nothing had been caught in the current of the music, feeling emotions they hadn't realized were waiting for them that day. The pianist had not intended to impress anyone. He had intended only to play. And yet the effect was undeniable. The music had transformed the square, if only for a short while, into a place of connection, reflection, quiet awe. The dynamics of the piece shifted, becoming more powerful, more resonant. His fingers danced across the keys, effortlessly, creating sounds that were at once strong and tender, precise yet flowing. The crowd responded unconsciously, leaning in, swaying slightly, some holding their breath as the melody built toward its peak. The music spoke of human experience, struggle, hope, longing, joy, all expressed without a single word. The audience could feel it, understand it, and respond to it in their own silent, personal ways. It was a collective experience, yet intensely individual. Each listener found something different in the notes, something that spoke directly to their own heart. A father standing with his child held the little boy close, both listening intently. The music seemed to fill them with a sense of wonder, something that went beyond age or understanding. A couple standing nearby exchanged glances, their expressions softening, hearts touched in ways neither had anticipated. Even the most skeptical in the crowd, those who had thought this was a joke at first, were now captivated, their disbelief replaced by admiration, their surprise replaced by quiet respect. The music had done what few things could. It had transformed doubt into awe, curiosity into emotional engagement. The pianist's hands moved with ease and precision, but also with emotion, each note carrying meaning, each pause allowing space for reflection. He allowed the melody to ebb and flow naturally, never forcing, never rushing, always attentive to the feeling within the music. The crowd responded, completely engaged, leaning forward, closing their eyes, absorbing every nuance. Some whispered quietly to each other, expressing their astonishment, their appreciation, or simply their inability to describe what they were feeling. There was no noise, no distraction, only a shared understanding, collective experience of beauty unfolding in real time. As the piece neared its conclusion, the music softened, becoming gentle, introspective, full of warmth and subtle emotion. The pianist allowed the final notes to linger, resonating in the air, carrying a sense of closure, reflection, and quiet triumph. The crowd remained silent for a heartbeat, suspended in the moment, unwilling to break the spell that had been created. Then, slowly the reactions began. Some clapped quietly, others whispered, some simply stood still, their eyes wide, their hearts full. There was a shared acknowledgement among strangers, a recognition that they had witnessed something extraordinary. The man had transformed an ordinary square into a space of emotion, connection, and awe, leaving everyone present touched in ways they could not have anticipated. The pianist leaned back slightly, breathing deeply, feeling the energy of the music still flowing through him. He looked at the crowd, seeing faces transformed by emotion, eyes reflecting wonder, hearts moved in silence. They had come expecting a moment of curiosity, perhaps amusement, and instead, they had experienced something unforgettable. They had thought it was a joke, but the music had spoken in ways words never could. In the stillness after the final note, the square was alive with a quiet, shared reverence, a moment that would remain in their memories long after they had gone on with their day. And in that moment, the man realized the profound truth of what had just happened. He had not only played music, he had touched lives, created connection, and left an indelible mark on those who had been willing to listen. The man slowly closed the piano cover, letting his hands rest lightly on top for a moment. His heart was still racing, his fingers tingling from the energy of the performance. The crowd around him had begun to react, some clapping softly, others whispering to each other, some simply standing in awe. He looked around, seeing faces filled with wonder, gratitude, and astonishment. People who had doubted him, people who had thought this was a joke, were now staring at him with respect and admiration. It was a feeling he had never experienced before, a combination of humility and quiet pride that made his chest swell in a way words could not describe. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment settle into his shoulders. Strangers began to approach him cautiously, not wanting to intrude, yet unable to resist the urge to speak. Asked simple questions, wanting to know who he was, how long he had been playing where he had learned to play so beautifully. Others simply smiled and nodded, their faces glowing with emotion, letting him know without words that what he had done mattered more than any explanation. He nodded politely, smiled softly, and thanked them quietly, not because he needed their approval, but because he appreciated their acknowledgement. He had shared something deeply personal. The response was both overwhelming and comforting. A few people recorded the performance on their phones, but the man barely noticed, nor did not play for recognition or fame, nor did he expect it. He had played because it was his expression, his voice, and now it had resonated with others. The impact was clear, though, as he watched the crowd slowly disperse, carrying a piece of the experience with them. Some whispered to each other, replaying what they had seen and heard, feeling emotions they hadn't expected in such an ordinary place. Some walked away silently, lost in thought, while others lingered, hoping for another note, another chord, another chance to feel the connection he had created. He walked away from the piano, feeling lighter than he had in years. The music had lifted something within him, something that fear and doubt had kept buried for too long. He realized that this moment was more than a performance. It was a turning point. He had faced the fear of being judged, the risk of embarrassment, and he had played anyway. In doing so, he had not only shared his talent with the world, but he had also discovered a deeper part of himself, a confidence and courage that had been hidden under years of quiet hesitation. Every step he took away from the piano felt like reclaiming a piece of his own life, a piece that had been waiting for him to embrace it fully. In the days that followed, he noticed subtle changes. People in the town began to recognize him, some with nods of respect, some with shy smiles. A few approached him in stores or on the street, complimenting his performance, sharing how it had moved them. It was not fame, it was not attention for its own sake, but it was acknowledgement or recognition that what he had shared had mattered. Each encounter reminded him that his music had reached beyond himself, touching lives he would never fully know. It was a quiet validation, a reminder that honesty and dedication could create impact even in unexpected ways. He returned home and found himself thinking about the performance repeatedly. He replayed each note in his mind, remembering the way the crowd had reacted, the way their eyes had softened, the way the energy of the square had shifted. He realized that music had the power to transform ordinary moments into something extraordinary. It had the power to connect strangers, to evoke deep emotions, to leave lasting impressions. And he'd been the one to do it, simply by being brave enough to play, by trusting himself and the music he loved. It was a revelation that filled him with gratitude and inspiration, a reminder that courage and passion could create beauty that transcended fear. Word of his performance began to spread quietly. Some shared videos on social media, though he did not seek them out. People talked to friends and family about the unexpected moment in the square, about the music that had stopped them in their tracks, about the ordinary man who had left everyone speechless. Invitations and opportunities began to appear, some small, some larger, but all carrying the potential to share his gift more widely. Yet he remained grounded, understanding that the true reward had not been recognition or opportunity, but the experience itself, the act of expressing something profoundly personal and connecting with others in a meaningful way. He found himself practicing with renewed energy, not out of necessity, not to impress, but to refine and expand what he could share with the world. Each session at the piano became a dialogue, a conversation with himself and the music, exploring new possibilities, discovering new depths. The fear that had once dominated his thoughts was no longer the same. It had been transformed into respect, into awareness of the vulnerability and power of sharing one's true self. Every note became a reminder of what courage could achieve. Every chord a testament to the human capacity for connection and expression. As weeks passed, he began to play in other places, still quietly, still modestly, but with confidence. Small performances in local cafes, community spaces, and public squares allowed him to explore the impact of his music in different contexts. People responded with warmth and gratitude, and each experience reinforced the lesson he had learned in that first public performance. The music was not about himself alone. It was about creating shared moments, about touching lives in ways that were subtle, profound, and lasting. And he embraced this truth fully, understanding that the power of music lay not in spectacle, but in authenticity and connection. He also began to reflect more deeply on his own life, realizing that many of his fears had been unfounded. That much of his hesitation had come from a desire to avoid judgment rather than a lack of ability. The experience at the piano had shown him that courage and authenticity could overcome doubt, and that taking risks, even small ones, could lead to transformative experiences. He carried this lesson into other areas of his life, approaching challenges with more confidence, trusting his instincts, and valuing his own voice and abilities. The music had changed him in ways that went far beyond performance. It had shaped his character, his outlook, and his understanding of what was possible in quiet moments. He would often return to the memory of that first performance, remembering the expressions on the faces of the crowd, the silence that had followed the final note, the subtle gestures of gratitude and awe. He thought of the little boy by the fountain, the woman with the coffee, the strangers who had paused mid-step, all drawn into the moment without planning to be. And he realized that the true magic of that day had not been in the applause, the attention, or the recognition, but in the shared experience, in the way music had connected hearts and minds without words, in the invisible threads that had formed between people who might never meet again.